The desert stretched endlessly, dry and unyielding under the hammer of the midday sun. Heat shimmered in the air, turning the cracked earth into a reflection of bones, a wasteland where even the wind seemed too tired to blow. Out here, survival wasn't a right. It was a battle, fought inch by inch, breath by breath. Poker Alice knew this better than anyone. She tightened her grip on the heavy water bucket slung at her hip, feeling the sun's heat claw through the thin cotton of her dress. Every step she took kicked up little clouds of dust, clinging to her skin like a second, grittier coat. This was no place for the weak, no place for hesitation. And yet, the desert had a way of humbling even the fiercest souls. You ever wonder? What makes a person stop and risk everything when the odds say, keep walking? That was the choice staring Poker Alice dead in the face. 100 yards ahead, something broke the monotony of dust and scrub. A shape, crumpled and still. At first, she thought it was an animal, some poor coyote done in by the heat. But, as she drew closer, the truth set her heart racing. It was a man. Navajo by the looks of him, his skin darkened not just by the sun but by blood. Dust matted into his black hair. His chest barely moved. An arrow jutted from his thigh, snapped. Often a cruel reminder that violence had found him before she did, Lice froze. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, rough and warning. You see a Navajo out here alone, girl, you best believe he ain't alone. He's bait. Others are near. And that's the thing about fear. It's loud. It tells you all the reasons. To turn away. Common sense screamed at her to leave him. Walk back to the cabin. Save herself. But hope. Hope's a stubborn thing. It's what gets people killed, and what makes them worth saving. Alice knelt beside the man, her hands trembling. The smell hit her first. Blood, sweat baked under the merciless sun, and something sharper. Fear. His lips were cracked, his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. There was no strength left in him, no threat. Just a man, dying. You got no right being here, she whispered, half to him, half to herself, as if the desert might overhear and decide her fate for her. With hands she could barely steady, Alice dipped her fingers into her precious water and let a few drops fall onto his parched lips. His body flinched at the touch, a weak groan escaping his chest, his eyelids fluttering, but never quite opening. Think about it. Would you have stayed? Risked your life for a stranger when you knew no one would come if things went wrong? Alice made her choice. She tore a strip from her scarf, pressed it against his wound, and whispered under her breath, "Don't you dare die after I walked all this way." The desert, vast and empty, offered no comfort. Alice knew she didn't have long. Buzzards were already circling high above. She dragged him across the brittle ground, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. She was a mile from her cabin, and she wouldn't make it carrying him the whole way. But she had to try. When the man stirred again, croaking for water, she didn't have the heart to refuse him, even though she knew how little she had to give. Cupping her hand, she let him drink from it, and for a moment the harsh lines of his face softened. Above them, the sky darkened for just a second, a hawk riding the thermals. A reminder, predators circle the weak. They always have. Poker Alice didn't waste another thought. Bracing herself under his dead weight, she stumbled one step, then another, the cabin finally coming into view. A weathered speck of stubbornness stitched together by hope and fear. Inside, she dragged open the trapdoor to the root cellar, lowering him into the cool, dusty darkness. He moaned, but she didn't stop until he was hidden from sight, covered in a threadbare quilt. Only when the cellar door thudded closed did Alice let herself slump against the wall, chest heaving. Out here, no one handed you second chances. She knew that, and yet she had just gambled her life on a dying man. Now here's the real question. Was it bravery? Or was it foolishness born of loneliness, of the aching kind of solitude that makes even the wrong choices seem like the only ones worth making? As the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched long across the cracked earth, Poker Alice loaded her father's old rifle and sat by the window, watching, waiting, because in the wilds of the West, mercy isn't free. It's a debt, and sooner or later, someone, or something, always comes to collect. The desert, they say, has no mercy. It doesn't pick sides, it just watches silent and vast while men decide whether to stand tall or be swallowed whole. Poker Alice understood that. She wasn't a stranger to hard choices. Out here, you couldn't afford to be. But that day, as she knelt beside a dying Navajo man, the choice wasn't just hard, it was dangerous. She could feel it in her bones, in the dry, scratchy wind that carried the faint scent of blood. Saving him wasn't just an act of kindness. It was a gamble with her life on the line. Still, Alice made her move. With trembling fingers, she let a few precious drops of water trickle onto his cracked lips. His body shuddered, a faint groan rasping from his chest. His eyes fluttered but didn't open. He was barely holding on. Now think about that. How much courage does it take to help a man when you know doing so could end yours? How often do we talk about kindness? When it's easy, when there's no price. But real kindness, and the kind that matters, always costs something. Alice tore a strip from her scarf and pressed it against the gaping wound on his leg. The fabric darkened fast, soaking up the blood. She worked quickly, glancing over her shoulder, every instinct screaming that she was running out of time. The desert didn't stay quiet for long, and buzzards weren't the only things that circled when blood was spilled. Dragging his limp body across the brittle earth felt like trying to pull a mountain. Every inch was a battle. Sweat stung her eyes. Her muscles screamed in protest, but step by step she made it, back to her weather-beaten cabin, a sagging skeleton of wood and stubbornness standing against the emptiness. Inside, she didn't waste time. Alice kicked open the heavy trapdoor leading to the root cellar, a cramped, musty hole dug deep to keep potatoes cool in the blistering heat. It wasn't much, but it was cover. Safety for now. She lowered the man down, gritting her teeth against his weight. He moaned, half-conscious as she pulled an old threadbare quilt over him. Dust rose in the dim light as she closed the hatch, muffling the thud with her whole body to keep the noise low. Then, finally, she slumped against the wall, heart pounding, so loud she could barely hear the silence outside. Here's the thing about the West no one tells you. It's not just the land that's hard. It's the people. Out here, kindness could mark you as weak. Helping a Navajo man could get you branded a traitor by your own kind. Alice knew what the settlers in town would say if they found out. She wasn't naive. She'd seen the looks, before heard the whispers. Her father, a man who'd married a half-Mexican woman, had taught her the cost of crossing the invisible lines drawn by fear and hate. And yet, wasn't this the very moment that defined a person? Not when things were easy, not when the choice was safe, but right here, right now, when doing the right thing meant standing alone. Leaning her head back against the wall, Alice whispered a bitter laugh. "You better live, Navajo," she muttered. "Otherwise I'm going to be haunting you from the other side." Outside, the desert stretched on, quiet, waiting. Inside, Poker Alice loaded her rifle, her father's old Winchester, worn smooth, from years of use, and set herself by the window. She watched the horizon, every nerve wired tight. Every gust of wind felt like a whisper of coming trouble. And make no mistake, trouble was coming. It always does, doesn't it? Whenever we take a stand, whenever we draw a line and say, this far, no farther, the world has a way of testing just how serious we are. So here's my question to you. Would you have done the same? Would you have knelt in the dirt, risking everything for someone who wasn't yours? For a stranger the world told you not to trust? Poker Alice did. She bet her life on it. And out there in the desert, with nothing but a loaded rifle and a spine made of pure iron, she waited to see if that gamble would pay off, or if it would cost her everything she had left. Morning came slow and heavy, the kind of morning that sits on your chest and makes you listen harder to the quiet. Poker Alice sat by the window, rifle balanced across her knees, eyes burning from a night of restless watching. Outside, the desert, stretched wide and empty, or so it seemed. But the desert's silence is a liar. It started with a rumble so low it was more a feeling than a sound. Alice stiffened. Her hand tightened on the rifle as she peered through a crack in the warped wooden wall. A line of figures emerged from the dust. Riders. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace like they had all the time in the world. There were a dozen at least. Feathers in their hair, rifles slung easily across their backs, spears gleaming under the early light. They didn't shout, didn't threaten. They didn't have to. Their silence was louder than any battle cry. Poker Alice's throat tightened. She wasn't naive. She knew what this was. They'd come for the wounded man she'd dragged into her root cellar, and she knew another thing just as well. Handing him over could mean saving her own skin. Not handing him over? Well, out here, mercy was a risk not everyone survived. Think about it for a second. What would you do? When survival and principle point in opposite directions, which one do you follow? Alice rose slowly, dust swirling around her boots as she stepped outside. The sunrise threw her shadow long across the ground. Her rifle hung loose in her hands, the barrel pointed low. No sudden moves. No need to spark a fire that didn't have to burn. The leader of the riders dismounted. He was tall, his face painted in sharp lines of white and red, eyes dark and unreadable. He stood still as stone, but there was a force in him, like the land itself was holding its breath around him. Alice cleared her throat, voice rough from dust and fear. "I ain't looking for trouble," she said. "But if you mean to bring, you'd best know I'll stand my ground." No reply, just that same silent waiting. Behind her, down in the cellar, the wounded man stirred, a soft groan slipping out into the morning air. Every rider's head turned at once. They knew he was here. Alice tightened her grip on the rifle. She could fight, bolt the door, fire. A few shots, maybe hit one before they overwhelmed her. But she wasn't stupid, she wasn't trying to start a war. "You want him," she said, steady as she could manage. "But you ought to hear the rest. He was dying when I found him. Would have been buzzard meat if I hadn't dragged him out of the dirt." The words hung there, heavy as stone. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the leader gave a single nod, sharp and final. Alice swallowed hard. Part of her wanted to believe that nod meant respect, meant understanding. But out here, you never really knew. Trust was a currency in short supply. She backed toward the cabin, keeping her movements slow, deliberate. At the trapdoor, she knelt and hauled it open. The wounded man blinked up at her, dazed and pale. She reached down, gripping under his arms, and heaved him up with a grunt of effort. His weight nearly buckled her knees, but she didn't stop, until he was out, wrapped in the quilt she'd thrown over him. Alice straightened up, chest heaving, and looked at the leader. "I'll give him to you," she said, "but I need your word. He doesn't die just because I pulled that arrow out." The leader stared at her for a long moment. Then, in a voice rough as gravel, he said, "Blood does not leave blood behind." There was something fierce in the way he said it, a pride that stirred something deep in Alice's gut. It reminded her of her own father, of the lessons he'd taught her before sickness took him. That family and loyalty were the only things that lasted in a world built to break you. She stepped back and let them take the wounded man from her arms. The younger warriors moved fast but carefully, lifting him onto a horse. The leader gave her a look, not a threat, not a promise, just a quiet acknowledgement. And just like that, they turned, forming a slow-moving line that disappeared into the haze, the wounded man cradled safe among them. Alice stood there alone again, watching the dust settle. Her rifle hung heavy in her hands. She had saved a life today. Maybe she'd saved her own in the process. Maybe not. But here's what. I believe real courage isn't loud. It's not about glory or gunfights. It's the quiet kind. The kind that stays put when every instinct says run. The kind that stands for something when no one's watching. So let me ask you, when it comes down to it, when the choice is between saving yourself and standing by, what's right? What kind of courage do you carry? Poker Alice didn't know what was coming next. She just knew she'd made her choice. And out here, on the unforgiving frontier, sometimes that's all you have. Your choice. And the grit to stand by it. The dust hadn't even settled when the next trouble showed up. Not from the desert this time, but from town. Poker Alice saw them first, a cluster of settlers on horseback, kicking up a cloud behind them like a coming storm. 6 men, rifles, slung across their saddles, faces set and grim. Word had traveled fast, too fast. The settlers had seen the Navajo riders, and they weren't the type to stop and ask questions. No, they came with an old story in their heads. One about enemies, blood, and land they thought was theirs by right. Alice's gut twisted. She turned to the Navajo leader, a man who hadn't even given her his name yet, but had trusted her enough to take back his wounded brother. She could see it in his eyes. They knew what was coming. And they were ready. But Alice, she wasn't ready to watch another senseless slaughter. Not if she could help it. "They'll shoot first," she said, voice low, urgent. "Don't even think about it." The leader's jaw tightened. His hand drifted toward the tomahawk hanging at his side. The warriors around him shifted, tension crackling in the air like a coming lightning strike. Alice made a decision then. Reckless, maybe even stupid. But out here, sometimes that's the only kind of decision worth making. She shoved her rifle into the leader's hands. "You'll need it more than me," she muttered. "But we don't have to fight. Not if we don't have to." He took it, more out of reflex than trust, and studied her, a slow, assessing look. For a moment, the two of them just stood there, two sides of a line nobody else could see. But the settlers didn't wait. A shout carried across the plain, angry, sharp. "There's Injuns at Boone's place. Load up, boys." Alice turned to the leader again. "You want to live?" she asked, half a dare, half a plea. "We fight together, or we all die alone." The leader smiled then, a grim flicker across his face. He handed the rifle back and gave a curt nod. The Navajo melted into the rocks, the scrub, the sand, more silent as smoke, ready. Alice dropped to one knee by the cabin, the butt of her rifle pressed tight against her shoulder. Her hands were trembling. Sure, but she had learned long ago that fear was just another thing you could ride like a horse, if you gripped the reins tight enough. The settlers came in fast, hollering, rifles raised. Their leader, Barton Clay, was a red-faced, heavy man with a battered shotgun, the kind of man who'd never learned to listen before shooting. "Move aside, woman," he bellowed. "We'll handle this." Alice rose slowly, keeping her rifle pointed low but ready. "They ain't here to fight," she called back. "Let 'em take their wounded and go." The settlers laughed, a nasty, sharp sound, the kind that makes the back of your neck itch. "Ain't no place for traitors here," one shouted. Another fired a shot, kicking up dust right at her feet. Alice flinched but held her ground. Behind her, a shot cracked, not aimed at the settlers but into the air, a warning. The Navajo had made their presence known, rifles gleaming in the morning sun. The settlers weren't laughing now. Still, fear's a hard horse to rein in. One of them, a twitchy young man, jerked his rifle up, wild-eyed. "Hold your fire!" Barton roared. But it was too late. The boy pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, but it didn't matter. Chaos exploded. Gunfire roared. Horses screamed. Dust boiled up in thick, blinding clouds. Alice hit the ground, rolling toward the woodpile for cover as bullets splintered the cabin wall above her. She fired back instinctively, aiming low. Not to kill, not yet. Just to make them think twice. The Navajo moved like a river, fast, silent, ruthless. Alice caught a glimpse of the young settler falling from his horse, clutching his shoulder. Another settler's horse bolted, riderless. Barton tried to rally his men, but panic spread faster than a prairie fire. One by one, the settlers broke, fleeing for town with whatever shreds of courage they had left, and then silence. The kind that rings in your ears and sits heavy on your chest. Alice lay still, breathing hard. Slowly, she pushed herself up, rifle loose in her hands. Around her, the Navajo gathered, battered but standing. The leader, his temple bleeding from a grazing shot, met her eyes across the smoking, broken ground. "You fight good," he said, voice low. Not as a compliment, but as a statement of fact. Alice almost laughed. Or maybe cried. "Ain't brave," she muttered. "Just stubborn." He nodded, a rare flicker of respect in his eyes. And standing there in the dust and smoke, Poker Alice realized something. She hadn't fought for pride or land. She'd fought for something deeper, for loyalty, for the belief that right and wrong still mattered even in a world that tried to grind them to dust. The settlers had fled. The battle was over. For now. But in that fragile peace, standing shoulder to shoulder with people she'd once been taught to fear, Poker Alice knew. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was finally living. When the dust finally settled and the last echoes of gunfire faded into the wide silence of the plains, Poker Alice stood alone. The settlers were gone, but so was the life she had known. You see, in a place like this, there are some lines you can't uncross, and saving a Navajo man, fighting alongside his people, well, that was more than just a line. It was a choice the town would never forgive. Alice understood that without anyone having to say a word. She could picture it, clear as day. The tight-lipped women in the church pews, the men spitting tobacco into the dirt, their eyes hard with judgment. It wasn't just that they hated the Navajo. It was that they feared anyone who chose their own path, who refused to play by the unspoken rules. And Poker Alice. She'd just made her choice loud enough for the whole desert to hear. The Navajo, warriors moved around her, gathering their wounded, checking their horses. They spoke in low voices, calm and deliberate. No one rushed. Out here, patience was a survival skill. Alice didn't move. She stood there with the burnt shell of her cabin behind her, the life she'd built now nothing more than smoke rising into the pale morning sky. She didn't belong in town anymore. Maybe she never really had. Funny how a single moment can show you the truth you've been trying not to see. The leader, the one whose name she still didn't know, walked toward her. He was tall, lean, carrying the kind of stillness that doesn't come from weakness but from knowing exactly who you are. He studied her for a long moment. Then he simply said, "You have no home here now." It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even a judgment. Just a truth spoken plain and honest. Alice nodded. Never really did. That earned the smallest flicker of something. Maybe respect, maybe understanding, and in his dark eyes. Then he turned, gesturing toward the horizon where the land stretched wild and broken, as far as anyone could see. "Come," he said. Not a command, not a plea, just an offer. Think about that for a moment. How many of us, after losing everything, would have the courage to step into the unknown, to leave behind every piece of comfort, every scrap of familiarity, and choose the hard road, the one with no promises? Alice looked back once at her cabin. The bullet holes in the walls, the shattered windows, the memory of what she'd thought was home. But home, she realized, had never been about four walls and a roof. It wasn't a place at all. It was where you stood your ground. It was the people you chose to fight for. Without another word, she slung her rifle over her shoulder and stepped forward. The warriors parted silently, making room for her in their ranks. They didn't welcome her with cheers or handshakes. They didn't have to. In their world, actions spoke louder than words. She had fought. She had bled. She had chosen. And sometimes, that's all the belonging you need. Alice mounted a spare horse, the leather saddle worn but sturdy. As she rode out with them, the rising sun painted the land in gold and red, the colors of both fire and hope. Behind her, the smoke from her burned cabin twisted up into the sky, a final farewell to a life she was leaving behind. She didn't look back. What was there to look at anyway? Ashes are ashes. But out ahead, that was something else. Wild. untamed, full of promise and peril. Alice didn't know where this path would lead. She only knew it was hers to walk now. And as the horses moved in a steady rhythm across the broken land, Poker Alice, or maybe just Alice, stripped of all the old names and expectations, felt something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Freedom. Real freedom. The kind you don't find by clinging to the past, but by daring to ride straight into the future, no matter how uncertain it might be. So let me ask you, if everything you thought you needed burned down around you, would you have the courage to ride forward into the unknown? Alice did, and sometimes that's the only way you find where you truly belong. The farther they rode, the more the world she used to know faded behind them, swallowed up by the dust and the sun. Poker Alice. No, not Poker Alice anymore. She was Kiona now. The name had been given to her quietly, without ceremony, but it carried a weight she felt deep in her bones. Kiona. It meant brown hills. Strong, steady, unmoving. The kind of name you had to earn out here, where nothing was promised and everything was fought for. The mountains rose up ahead, jagged teeth against the wide sky. It was hard country, rough, wild, unforgiving. The kind of place only those with grit in their veins could survive. And that was exactly why they were heading there. The Navajo didn't talk much as they traveled. There was no idle chatter, no wasted breath. Every move they made had a purpose. Even the horses seemed to understand. Their hooves struck the ground with a steady rhythm, no panic, no hesitation. At night they didn't light fires. No smoke, no glow to give away their position. They ate cold, dry food and wrapped themselves in blankets against the chill. The stars overhead burned white and fierce, scattered like salt across the dark sky. Kiona would sit a little apart sometimes, looking up at those stars, thinking about how small she was out here, and how that didn't scare her anymore. Because if the last few days had taught her anything, it was that real strength wasn't about size or how loud you could shout. It was about the choices you made when no one was watching, the kind of choices that cost you something. Have you ever had to start over? I'm not talking about moving to a new town or changing jobs. I mean truly start over. New name, new life, new blood around you. It's a kind of death and rebirth all rolled into one. It strips you down to your barest self and asks, who are you without all the things you thought made you you? Kiona was finding her answer out here, step by step. The Navajo didn't treat her like one of their own, not yet. Trust wasn't given. It was earned with sweat, with silence, with standing your ground when it counted. And Kiona understood that. She didn't expect smiles or easy friendship. She showed her worth in small ways, tending to the horses, helping the wounded, keeping watch when others slept. One night, as the cold bit hard into the skin and the wind whispered through the rocks, Chaitin, the leader who had first spoken to her, sat down beside her. He didn't say anything at first, just sat, letting the silence stretch between them like a bridge being built one quiet plank at a time. Finally, he spoke. You fight settlers, he said, not as a question, but as a fact. Kiona shrugged. I fight men who kill what they fear. Seemed fair. Chaitin gave a low grunt, halfway between a laugh and something else, something almost like approval. You leave your world. Now you have no world. It wasn't cruel. Just true. Kiona nodded, feeling the weight of that settle into her bones, and the freedom that came with it. She thought about the town she'd left behind, the faces pressed to windows, the whispered slurs, the narrow, ugly rules. She had never truly belonged there. Maybe that's why she had been able to walk away. I didn't belong to that world, she said simply. Chaitin didn't answer. He didn't need to. As dawn broke, staining the mountains in shades of fire and gold, they packed up and moved deeper into the high country. The land here was harsher but safer, harder to find, harder to reach. A place for those willing to live by their own rules and accept the costs that came with that freedom. Kiona rode with them, her rifle slung across her back, her heart steady. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Hardship, hunger, maybe death. But whatever came, she knew she would meet it with her head high. Out here, survival wasn't given. It was earned every day, every mile, with blood and bone and stubbornness. And Kiona, she was ready. You know, they say the West wasn't tamed. It survived, by people who chose the hard road, who found strength not in numbers, but in conviction. Kiona wasn't running from her past anymore. She was riding straight into her future, raw, untamed, and real. And maybe that's what freedom really is. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward anyway. The mountains gave them shelter. High, jagged walls of stone and scrub that swallowed sound and made men think twice about coming after them. But even the hardest country can't hold back bad news forever. Word of the fight. Of the settlers, beaten and driven off, had traveled faster than any horse could ride. It reached the nearest army fort, and with it came a promise. They would finish what the settlers couldn't. By the time the scout returned, breathless and grim, the warning was clear. Soldiers were coming, and they weren't riding in to negotiate. Kiona sat by the fireless camp cleaning her rifle with slow, deliberate strokes. She didn't need the scout's words to tell her what she already felt. A low, steady pressure in the air, like the land itself was bracing for a storm. Chayton came to her side. His face was stone, but his eyes held the weight of too many battles fought and too many lost. You ride close, he said quietly. You see a chance. You run. Kiona shook her head before he finished. I'm done running from cowards. For a moment he held her gaze. Then slowly, he nodded. At dawn the soldiers appeared, banners snapping in the cold wind, rifles gleaming like sharpened teeth under the pale sun. They formed a line across the valley mouth, a wall of blue coats and loaded muskets. Among them, riding proud and vengeful, was Barton Clay. His shoulder was bandaged from the last fight, but he looked no less mean. He pointed a thick finger straight at Kiona, shouting for all to hear. There she is, the traitor. String her up with the rest. Have you ever noticed how cowards always shout the loudest? Kiona felt the old fear coil in her gut, but she pushed it down, hard. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Not today. Chayton gave a sharp signal and the Navajo warriors melted into the rocks and gullies, becoming part of the land itself, shadows with teeth. The soldiers called out, demanding surrender, harsh words, empty promises. Barton was right there, spitting venom, stirring the pot. And in that moment, Kiona made her choice. She raised her rifle, slow, deliberate, and fired. The shot cracked across the valley, echoing off the stone. Walls. Barton Clay jerked in his saddle, a scream tearing from his throat as he tumbled to the dust, clutching his shattered shoulder. The soldiers wavered, fear rippling through their line like wind across tall grass. Chayton's warriors struck, fast and brutal, flanking the soldiers, before they even knew where the first shot had come from. Gunfire exploded. Smoke thickened. The air. Horses screamed and reared. Kiona moved like she had in the last fight. Low, fast, precise. Fire, reload, move. Every shot mattered. Every breath counted. The battle was chaotic, but in chaos Kiona found clarity. She caught a glimpse of a young soldier, barely more than a boy, tossing down his rifle and raising his hands high, face pale as chalk. Others followed, surrendering while the rest turned tail and fled, their courage scattering like leaves in the wind. When the smoke cleared, the valley was littered with broken gear and broken pride. The soldiers who could still walk were sent back toward the fort on foot, their weapons stripped, their heads hung low. Kiona stood there, breathing hard, rifle still warm in her hands. Blood trickled from a scrape on her cheek. Around her, the Navajo gathered, battered, bruised, but victorious. Chayton approached, blood seeping from a shallow cut along his ribs. He studied her for a long moment, then said in that steady way of his, "You fight good." Kiona gave a tired smile. "Ain't brave," she said, "just stubborn." But deep down, she knew better. Sometimes stubbornness is the only kind of bravery that matters. The soldiers were gone. The valley was theirs. For now. And as Kiona looked around at the people standing beside her, people who had fought, bled, and stood their ground, she realized something powerful. She hadn't just found a place. She had found her people. Here's a question for you. When the world draws a line and dares you to cross it, will you? When it tells you to stay down, to be quiet, to accept things as they are, will you fight for what's right anyway? Kiona did. And out here in the dust and the blood and the wild beating heart of the land, she learned the most important truth there is. Freedom isn't given. It's taken. When the dust of battle settled and the valley returned to silence, something in the air shifted. It wasn't just the victory. It was something deeper. A recognition. A quiet understanding passed between warriors, the kind you don't find. In words, Kiona, the woman who once went by Poker Alice, stood among them, rifle slung across her back, blood drying on her sleeve. She wasn't an outsider anymore. She wasn't a settler. She wasn't a ghost clinging to a broken past. She was one of them. The name they gave her, Kiona, wasn't just a word. It was a promise. Brown hills. Strong, steady, enduring. Not the tallest mountain, not the wildest river, but the earth itself, the kind of strength you build a life on. Think about that. How rare is it really to find a place where you're not judged by where you came from, but by what you choose to stand for? Kiona hadn't just found a home. She had earned it The sun climbed higher. They prepared to move. There was no celebrating, no lingering. In the West, you learned quickly. Survival doesn't wait for parades. You pack your gear, tend your wounded, and keep riding. But for Kiona, this wasn't just another move. It was the start of something new. She looked once toward the horizon, where the land cracked open into endless ridges and hidden canyons. Wild country. Hard country. The kind of place where only the stubborn and the brave could carve out a life. Behind her, smoke still curled from the battlefield, a black scar against the clear blue sky. It would fade with time, like all scars do, but it would never completely disappear. And maybe that was a good thing. Some scars are reminders, not of pain, but of the strength it took to heal. Chayton approached, his steps soft in the dust. He didn't say much. He rarely did. He just gave her a nod, one warrior to another, the kind of nod that says, "You're one of us now. You've earned your place." Without a word, Kiona mounted her horse. The animal shifted beneath her, sensing her weight, accepting her as easily as the tribe had. Around her, the warriors gathered, their faces weathered by sun and time, but their eyes sharp, clear. Together they rode out, a loose formation moving steadily into the wilderness. They didn't leave tracks, they didn't look back, and neither did she. Because Kiona knew something most people never learn. Sometimes home isn't a place you're born into. It's a place you fight for, a place you choose. She wasn't running from the past anymore. She was riding straight into the future, unafraid, unchained, and unbreakable. Now, let me ask you, when life gives you that choice, to stay where it's safe or to ride toward something wild and unknown, which way will you go? Most people stay. Most people settle. But not Kiona. She chose the hard road, the wild road, and in doing so, she found something most folks only dream about: true freedom, not handed to her, not bought or bargained for, but earned, mile by mile, scar by scar. Out in that vast, untamed land with the sun at her back and the wind in her face, Kiona wasn't just surviving, she was finally living. And sometimes, that's all the happy ending you need.